The Somme anniversary is approaching, something that always sharpens my focus as I think back to the men I knew who fought there in 1916 and the many times I've stood in different parts of that Somme landscape on the 1st of July, remembering what happened on that fateful day. The Somme dominates so much of our understanding of the Great War and of our remembrance of it too. Perhaps too much at times. The war wasn't just the Somme in 1916, and when we compare the operations there in that fateful year to Somme 1918, for example, it's like looking at two different armies in terms of the British and Commonwealth experience. But in many ways our obsession with the Somme is perhaps understandable. As A.J.P. Taylor, that great historian, said, it was a move, that period of the Battle of the Somme, from the dying embers of an old world to a new one, a world of industrialised warfare and killing on an industrial scale, something that would characterise much of the rest of the century. It may not have been the death of innocents on the Somme, as some writers have claimed, but it changed how warfare was seen, from imagery of the battle to the Somme film itself, the first time a proper film, had been made about an operation, a battle like this, to how the staggering losses that were suffered on the Somme in 1916 affected people and communities across Britain and the Empire, to how the soldiers themselves viewed the war and would express that in fiction and poetry and in art too. C.R.W. Neverson's Paths of Glory, painted about the time of the Battle of the Somme, shows two dead British Tommies lying in the mud close to the German wire. It was too real, that painting, too reflective of the reality of that new world of warfare, that Neverson's painting was censored at the time and only properly viewed after the war was over. And today, I'm pleased to say that it's in the collection of the Imperial War Museum. The Somme changed the world forever, coined its own meaning in its very name, the Somme, and one still on the lips of those viewing modern warfare in Ukraine with its mud, trenches and shattered woodland, which Neverson might have found some good subject matter for his paintings. And at the heart of it are those men who marched down the dusty lanes of Picardy, onwards, ever onwards, to an uncertain future 110 years ago. All of them with a rendezvous in that vast Somme landscape, and above them the skylarks filling the air with their song. Now for this week's questions. Question number 1 comes from Ross McPherson. While I was reading an article about the latter stages of the Battle of the Somme, the concrete bunkers of the Quadrilateral were mentioned. Also that they are still there despite attempts over the last century to destroy them, and it sparked a question I've often wanted to ask. I know the German army was in a position on the Somme long before the battle, but how did they manage so much construction with concrete, not just on the Somme but in other areas of the front line too? Did the opposing allies know what was being built, and were they somehow unable to stop it? Or were the bunkers and towers built behind the lines and then ground given up by the German forces to consolidate around these fortifications? Well, I guess in the siege war that the First World War was, Ross, fortifications like this, strongpoints, concrete bunkers of all kinds of shapes and sizes, dimensions, and density as well, because they were far more common on some battlefields than others, are all part of that static war that the Western Front rapidly became. And the Germans were particularly adept in constructing these. Now, first of all, you mentioned the Quadrilateral. There's a couple of quadrilaterals on the Somme. There's that trench network near to Serre that we discussed in some recent episodes, which probably had some concreted positions beneath it, but nothing, to my knowledge, up on ground level. And then there was another quadrilateral, another trench system near the village of Ginchy on the Somme, and the fighting reached that area in September of 1916. And I'm pretty sure it's those bunkers that you're talking about. When I first went to the Somme in the 1980s, And when I lived there, the remains of those bunkers that you speak about were very visible in the fields. And I think in Lynn McDonough's book that came out in 1983, there are some photographs showing those bunkers. But I'm sad to say that they don't appear to be there today, or if they are, they're buried beneath that landscape now, because that's an area where quite a big wind farm was constructed in the last few years. And there's been quite a few localized changes there. So you used to be able to come out of the village and go to the Guards Memorial, close to where the Guards Division had been fighting in this area, on that road between Ginchy and the next village of Le Boeuf. And near to the Guards Memorial was evidence of these concrete bunkers from the Quadrilateral. But there's no evidence at ground level there now, just a gravel car park close to one of the big wind farms. So it's all part of that changing landscape. But to kind of cut to the heart of what you're asking about here, the concrete defences that the Germans built, the Allies did know about them. I mean, some could be seen from Allied trenches. These would appear often overnight, sometimes disguised, completely disguised or partially disguised. And they would also then appear on air photos, whether they were in the front line, the second line, the third line, or beyond the main battlefield area. And we see this and we know this because they then get marked on trench maps. And when you look at trench maps, they often mention concrete bunkers or buildings that had been concreted. So you see the shape of a building marked on the map with a little C next to it, indicating that there's some kind of concrete construction there, making that into a fortification. So the knowledge of these bunkers was there on the part of the Allies, certainly on the British side, when you see how much attention was given to photographing these positions from the air and then mapping them. And while they probably weren't aware of every single concrete construction, because some had been so well disguised inside buildings, up on the Albers Ridge, there were observation towers, for example, built inside granaries and factories and chimneys and all kinds of things, which could not be seen except from inside that structure and were not realised that they were there until that ground was eventually swept up. So this kind of thing wasn't uncommon, and the Germans invested a lot in concrete technology because it's static warfare technology, it's defensive technology. You can't pick a bunker up and take it into battle. So the Germans, who were on the defensive for most of the war, used structures like this, fortifications, concreted fortifications, to defend their ground. And this becomes an important kind of linchpin, really, in the way that they defend the landscape of the Western Front, whether that's in the flat fields of Flanders, the rolling chalk land of the Somme, or right down in the Vosges Mountains. When I was on a trip there recently, you can see, in the springtime anyway, you can see quite a lot of those concrete constructions in that area of the battlefield. And when you go to places like Lelonge, whether the trench is up on the top of the mountains there, then you can see the kind of structures that were built there out of concrete as well. So even up a mountain, the Germans were able to build this kind of defensive technology. And on the Somme front, though, there's less of them compared to other parts of the line. Certainly in terms of the 1916 perspective, the bunkers that were at the Quadrilateral near Ginchy were unusual. Why the Germans particularly chose to put them there, I'm not entirely sure. There are some in that area, but generally when we survey the Somme from a 1916 perspective, there's not that many bunkers up on the surface level. There are some, and we'll come on to some of those in a minute, but I would guess that most of the concreted structures were probably beneath the battlefield. And that's true of quite a few sectors of the Western Front. The Germans realised that if you created bunker systems and shelters beneath the battlefield to protect your troops from Allied artillery, and then perhaps concreted tunnels to take them from those bunkers where they were protected up to the front line. So if an attack comes in, the barrage lifts, they've been protected in their bunkers, and they can move from that concrete shelter via a concrete tunnel to get into the front line, set up their weapons and start killing the enemy in no man's land. So on the Somme, the above-level concreted bunkers that we perhaps more characterise with this type of defensive structure are less common. And the Germans were able to do all of this because they made use of the infrastructure behind their lines. They had roads and railways and canals that they could bring up all the material to build these concrete structures. And then down in the Vosges, up in the mountains there, they even constructed cable car systems to take that material up so that bunkers could be built up there. So it's quite a sophisticated way of really using this technology, and it kind of mirrored really the whole approach to resupply and the use of German industry, for example, on their side of the battlefield to enable their troops to try and achieve victory, even if that was just holding the Allies at bay with concrete bunkers. And in terms of what remains of this concrete defensive technology right across the Western Front, as we've said, there's lots of examples of it. Probably on the British sector of the Western Front, the most dense area of these bunkers is that forgotten front between Armentières and La Bassée, where I think there's something like over 2,000 German concrete structures from the First World War. But on the Somme, the 1916 Somme battlefields, probably one of the most famous is the concrete bunker at the Pope's Nose near the Ulster Tower at Chapval. And this is quite a small concrete structure, circular shape. And when you stand next to it, I mean, many guidebooks say that it's a machine gun position. It's not. It's an observation post that was constructed into the German trench system there. It had steps going down into it. And you can see by the size within that bunker, there's not enough room for any kind of weapon systems there. It's simply for observation. And when you stand there and you look around, you can see why it was chosen as a spot for an observation post, because you can see for miles and miles. So that's probably a very frequently visited one. And there were concrete structures underneath the German positions in and around the Schwaben Redoubt close by, with, it is said, concreted tunnels taking Germans into the nearby hamlet of Saint-Pierre-d'Ivion. So if you look at the kind of German schematics for some of these defences, you will see examples of this. But coming back to what is there on the landscape today, we're not going to look at every single concrete bunker on the Somme, but a few notable ones. So if you take the track to the right of the Ancre British Cemetery and follow that in the direction of Beaumont Hamel, about halfway up the hill, as you get towards the crest of the ground that you're walking up towards, there's a concrete bunker on the right-hand side there. And when you compare that to the trench maps, again, it's very near the front line positions and probably is, once again, a observation bunker. Don't think it's a machine gun bunker. There's no kind of indication of that, really. But if not either of them, it's probably some kind of command or signals bunker. But its position, to me, indicates that, again, the view that you've got from there, back towards Chapval, back towards Hamel, across towards Beaumont Hamel, across to where the British front lines were, then almost certainly this was a point in which the Germans were using this for observation. In other areas, Lousy Wood, not far from the Quadrilateral that you asked about, there is a German bunker on the corner of Lousy Wood, which you can either walk up to from Combles, or you can walk around the edge of the wood from Bully Wood around to that corner of Lousy Wood where this bunker is located. That was an area where the London Division was fighting in September of 1916, 56th London Division, and there's at least one, I think 2 plaques on there now to men who were killed in that area who do not have known graves. And if you come back into the village of Guillemont, there's another type of concrete structure there, which is a German infantry or signals headquarters shelter, which is a triple-topped bunker in a field right near to one of the farms, and they're kind of oval-shaped bunker entrances. I've been down in those ones myself. The former mayor there, Monsieur Dazin, opened them up for some filming that we did many years ago, and we went down on ladders, and it was a triple-chambered bunker that was probably used for some kind of headquarters purpose, and then it was taken over by the British, who used it exactly the same way, because there was British writing indicating that there had been an orderly room in there, for example, on the concrete wall. But there have been loss of bunkers as well as these ones that remain. Some have disappeared. So up at Gommecourt, right on the edge of the village towards Fonquevilliers, there was quite an impressive German bunker there, and then sometime in the 90s, early 2000s, that was removed by digging underneath it and collapsing it into the ground. So not all that was once there still survives today. But this kind of technology, bunker technology, absolutely characteristic of that siege war on the Western Front. Question number 2 comes from Richard Binning. At the outbreak of the war, we often hear that both sides expected a quick conflict with decisive victory. There was talk of home before Christmas. But how exactly did the British and the Germans anticipate the war would play out? Would it be similar to fairly recent conflicts, such as the Napoleonic Wars, perhaps? And what territorial or other gains did they aim to achieve? Well, I think the biggest anticipation of all nations that were plunged into the First World War in Europe was it was going to be a war of movement. It was going to mirror recent conflicts within Europe, where wars of movement had led to different outcomes. Some good ones for Germany. I mean, Germany had come into existence following its victory against France in the Franco-Prussian War. And while there were many novels written about what a future war in Europe within France might be, we spoke about Colonel Drian, Émile Drian, who as Capitaine d'Anrit wrote this whole series of novels predicting what fortification war, for example, static war, might be in the future with the forts that were then being constructed along France's borders. So there was kind of conflicting ideas that there would be wars that were similar to what had happened before in the preceding century, and there were those who thought perhaps it might be a modern version of those wars with new technology sitting alongside the old, and the whole development of different things over the course of the last 100 years, from barbed wire to the ability to provide canned food so that you could send men into static positions for a very long time and feed them without disease taking hold of an army, and the invention of automatic weapons and the increased development of artillery to super heavy kind of scales. It was thought that all of this would have some kind of effect on what future war would be, but no one, just like the kind of military pundits of today, could really truly predict what the First World War would turn into. And if we look at the beginning of the war, the German anticipation of that war in the West was based entirely around its Schlieffen Plan, that plan that had been drawn up in the years before the First World War by Count von Schlieffen to launch a lightning war, a blitzkrieg, if you like, against an enemy, France, to knock that enemy out in the West so that the Germans could concentrate on that Western enemy's ally in the East, Russia, which was a much, much bigger prospect, a more difficult prospect to defeat. So Germany's role in the opening phase of the war was to mobilise its armies, move its men to the borders using its railway system, and then strike a blow against the French, knock them out, and then focus on the Russian bear, as you often see in German propaganda of that period. The British view would be very different. They were kind of always on the sidelines, as they had been for 99 years since the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. They had not committed to any European conflicts in the 19th century, despite occasionally being asked to, with countries like Denmark, for example, asking for assistance. Britain had kept out of that European conflict because it had fought a colonial war in that period. So its focus was on empire building. But its war plan, if you like, once it was committed, with the invasion of Belgium, the tearing up of the Treaty of London, the Germans not respecting the conditions of Belgian neutrality and refusing to withdraw their troops, drew Britain into a European conflict. And its initial war plan was based around the implementation and mobilisation of a British expeditionary force, the BEF, to take them from Britain via main ports in the south across to France, probably to Le Havre, set up a base at Rouen, and then take the army up to the flanks of the French and kind of see what happened, really. That was essentially what this was about, because no one could truly predict the routes that the Germans would come. And while there was an initial thought that they would sit there on the flanks of the French and wait for the Germans to arrive, instead, both forces, both the French and the British, move across the border into Belgium, and that leads to, for the British, the fighting at Mons, and on their flanks, the French fighting around Charleroi. Now, while the British Army was perhaps one of the more modern armies that went to war in 1914, an unusual army in that it was made up entirely of volunteers, whereas the French and the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians and the Germans all had vast conscript armies. The British were volunteers, but that meant their army was very, very small. And that really affected what their anticipation of the war would be in terms of the size of their army versus their allies, France's expectations of what the British would do, and also what they could possibly achieve against an enemy like Germany, given the size of the German army, which was vast compared to the British Expeditionary Force. So Britain went to fight a new European war with an army well equipped and well trained, but still thinking it would be this war of movement, which it was, of course, in the first few weeks and months, until the very first point when that war of movement stopped around the Aisne in September 1914 and the very first trenches were dug. And although British soldiers, as with every soldiers in every army in Europe in 1914, had been trained to dig and prepare fortifications, from trenches to fire positions to dugouts, no one thought that that would then develop into the scale that the Western Front would become by that winter of 1914-15. And in terms of how previous conflicts really, I guess, influenced the British Army, for Britain it had been a colonial period where it had fought all over Africa and in India and in many, many other places besides. The Napoleonic War was a century ago from the Great War, and given that it tied up the British Army and Navy for something like 2 decades, I would guess that most people within the British armed services didn't want a conflict on that kind of scale again. But you mentioned territorial gains, what were countries after in terms of this conflict. For France and Britain, this was more of a defensive posture they were going to war with. For Germany, this was about defeating 2 major enemies, the French and the Russians. But one of the things I think that the Germans, after the Franco-Prussian War, had perhaps thought about was that while they'd occupied France and annexed a whole chunk of France with Alsace-Lorraine, they hadn't taken away France's colonies. And I think that if Germany had been successful in 1914 and overrun France, they would have occupied it, and more importantly, they would have occupied French colonies, particularly in Africa as well. And even if the British had not gone to war to defend the Belgians or to help the French as they had promised, then I don't think Britain would have been able to keep out of this conflict. Something we get asked quite a lot on battlefield tours. Could Britain have stood to one side in this war? Well, if Germany had overrun France and taken control of its colonies, then the war would have almost certainly turned to Africa, because if you look at that map of Africa, it's dominated by British colonies, it's dominated by French colonies, and if they suddenly became German, then the British were not going to just stand there and let that happen, and there would have been some kind of conflict within Africa over who controlled that wider colonial area of Africa. So it would have been a very different kind of war indeed. I think it's difficult to really assess what nations' anticipations of war really were, but there is no doubt, as you suggest in your question, that every side thought it would be a quick war. They'd go to war, they'd settle their differences, and in the terms of the British, the war would be over by Christmas. The Germans used that phrase, home before the leaves fall, so home by the autumn. That wasn't going to be the reality. The strange conditions that led to the whole development of military technology and weaponry in that century between the Napoleonic Wars and the Great War, and all of the experience of 19th century warfare, created the conditions that made a Western Front scenario possible. And of course, within a few months, that wasn't just an ideal. The Western Front was a reality, and a very different type of war would follow. Question number 3 comes from Ian MacDonald. My query relates to the Hindenburg Line, which has always fascinated me. First, how much of the structure is still present, and is it approachable and possible to get a meaningful insight into the battles fought there in a short visit, and where would you start? And second, how was it the Allied forces were taken so much by surprise when they discovered that the Germans had retreated? I thought that with the growth of sophisticated intelligence gathering, they would have been better informed. Well, first of all, let's say what the Hindenburg Line was. The Hindenburg Line, or as the Germans called it, the Siegfriedstellung, not to be confused with the Siegfried Line of the Second World War, was a massive system of defences built in response to the outcome of the Battle of the Somme. In the autumn of 1916, the Germans realised although the British and the French may not completely break through on the Somme front, then the German armed forces there would be left holding positions that they could not hold indefinitely. And if the fighting settled down to a winter pause, then in the following spring, the Allies would attack there and break the German line. So a conscious decision was made to leave the Somme front behind and withdraw into some new defences which were constructed in that winter of 1916-17, using specialised German troops to build the fortifications and a huge amount of conscripted French labour and also thousands of Russian prisoners of war to come over from the Eastern Front where they'd been captured and be used essentially illegally to work on the construction of these new defences. And when they were ready, the Germans simply withdrew into them. And you referenced that point in which one day the British essentially woke up and the Germans were no longer there. Now, how was that possible? Well, the Germans made every kind of noise, every intimation that there were German troops still there, and gradually and slowly withdrew their men to a point where only a handful were there, and then suddenly there was no activity on their front, and the British sent over raiders, trench raiders, to go and have a look, see what was going on, and they reported that the Germans had withdrawn, there were no Germans in their front line, and some kind of withdrawal had taken place. Aircraft were dispatched to try and photograph what was going on. There had been some evidence of the work on the Hindenburg Line taking place, but I don't think anyone had really joined the dots to work out that the Germans intended to build these new fortifications tens of miles behind their existing front line and then simply pull back into them. But that's exactly what happened in February and March of 1917. And although the Germans did pull back, they didn't pull back completely. So they left pockets of troops here and there to slow down that British and Allied advance, because the withdrawal was not just on the British front, it was facing French troops as well. And both nations faced this rather strange prospect of following up a retreating enemy and then being slowed down in open warfare again, with lots of obstacles, trees cut down on roads, mines blown at crossroads, delayed action mines in buildings, all kinds of other things, as well as small firefights that would slow down your advance because you were walking into territory that you really had no idea where anything was. So British and French troops were far more cautious under those kind of conditions. And if you want to know more about the Hindenburg Line, there is a previous episode about it in the Old Frontline archive, so go back to that episode to learn more. Now, you ask about what can we see of it today. Well, despite the fact that it was this massive system of defences that was constructed from near Arras via Cambrai right down to near Soissons, and then there were bolt-ons added to it later on in the conflict as well, it's interesting that there's not as much as you would think that survives of the Hindenburg Line at ground level. The trenches out in those vast open fields around Arras and Cambrai, they've gone. They've been filled in. Despite their size, despite their depth, they've been filled in. The big thick belts of wire probably pushed into them and then covered over. What you do see are some bunkers, particularly in that Arras and Cambrai area, that are near to the front and second line positions. So some of these are observation bunkers that were in the forward area of the German trenches. Others were weapon shelters, so there'd be a mortar team or a machine gun team in there firing over the second line, over the first line, onto no man's land. There's a few examples of those around Arras and Cambrai. So if you go to those battlefields and you use one of the Battleground Europe books about Arras or Cambrai, then you will come across quite a lot of them. But to see some of the sizable bunkers that were part of the Hindenburg Line, you've got to go further back, because the ones that were built above ground level tended to be, and were large, tended to be much further back from the battlefields. And around Cambrai, quite a few of those now have been preserved, have information panels, and you can do a little tour around that area. Villages like Marcoing, for example, just south of Cambrai, near to the canal systems there's quite a few of these bunkers that are marked on Google Maps where you can go and see them, and sometimes go into them as well. So it's worth doing a bit of research on that. In terms of seeing Hindenburg Line trenches, as we've said, a lot of those were in vast open fields and they've been filled in. But there were sections of woodland where the Hindenburg Line ran through it. And when you use some of the LiDAR scan material that's out there on the internet, which shows parts of the Western Front and the trench systems beneath the tree canopies, you can pick out some locations where there are Hindenburg Line trenches. The only issue is that French woodland is usually private. So if you find an area where there are Hindenburg Line trenches, then you've got to get permission to go into those wooded areas to go and see them. So a few years ago, they opened up a little bit of Havrincourt Wood, for example, close to Havrincourt village, and there's a whole network of German Hindenburg Line trenches that are in there. But I'm not sure how often that kind of thing actually happens. You're better off doing your research and, again, contacting the local town hall and seeking permission if you find a particular area of the Hindenburg Line that you're interested in where there are evidence of its trenches still there. I mean, it is incredible that such a German defensive network that was so influential on the outcome of battles in 1917-18 that there is so little evidence of it. And again, a good chunk of what the Hindenburg Line was about was below the surface. So its tunnels, its shelters, some of its machine gun bunkers that were quite low slung, with the machine guns not firing from apertures at the front of the bunker, but the teams coming out the back and sending the machine guns up on the roof. After the war, soil was often thrown over those to cover them up. So they are there, but they're just beneath the surface. And in terms of the Allies being taken by surprise, in terms of the construction of the bunkers, we've spoken about how they were when the Germans finally did pull back. But by 1917, there was much improved intelligence gathering. The whole network of air photos that had been taken over the Western Front, creating these mosaics of photographs where a huge amount of information could be gathered from those, and the increasing really identification of what was seen on these aerial images, with handbooks to show how you interpreted an air photo, that was becoming much more sophisticated. But that kind of intelligence gathering could be costly, because the enemy would send up their aircrafts to try and take out your observation planes that were taking these photographs, and so they didn't always make it back home. And things could just slip through, which is essentially what kind of happened, really, with the construction of the Siegfriedstellung or the Hindenburg Line. But as that German retreat pulled back to these newly constructed positions, and the British and the French followed up behind in the British sector, then aircraft, as we said, were dispatched to find out what was going on. That then led to the discovery of these trenches, and then increased flights, increased ground level mapping once British soldiers got to the point where they began to dig in front of the Hindenburg Line, and then basically a resurvey of a new battlefield took place to create new maps and new air photo mosaics showing the front lines that the British were now facing on this new part of the Western Front. And that information gathering moved apace, really, so that information could be disseminated amongst units on the ground very, very quickly indeed. And if you think that in most cases they got to that position, the British, where they were facing these German Hindenburg Line positions by late March of 1917, less than a few weeks later, the Battle of Arras takes place on the 9th of April 1917, attacking those very same positions. So by then, they've gathered air photos, new trench maps have been printed, and British forces, British commanders know where they're advancing, and more importantly, know what positions they're up against. And I guess when we watch a film like 1917, which, as you know perhaps from this podcast, is a film that I really like and I really rate, not a perfect film, far from it, But I guess it kind of gives that idea, gives that impression that somehow the British were completely taken by surprise. And there were elements of that in this story, as we've said, but the way that a British army by then could react to a changing situation, I think speaks volumes of how it moved on by this period of the war. So while it was a challenge with the Germans withdrawing to these new positions, very quickly the information and understanding and intelligence that was needed to take that fight forward again was provided by the eyes in the sky of the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Engineer mapping survey sections on the ground, helping to make those new trench maps that would be so vital in the coming offensives against that Hindenburg Line. Our fourth and final question comes from Benjo on the Discord server, another way that you can leave questions for the Q&As. Benjo says, I have a question which might seem a little bit gross, but I think it's important. Was toilet paper available in trench latrines? I remember listening to a veteran who fought in Gallipoli, and he said he had to use his hands and wipe it on his trousers. No wonder there was so much dysentery there, if that's true. Was the soldier himself responsible for taking pieces of newspaper or whatever himself had around him when he needed to go to the toilet and use these latrines? Well, it's a pretty unpleasant subject, but as you rightly say, it's a really important one. If soldiers eat and soldiers drink, then what goes in must come out. And this was a big problem from the very beginning of this war when it went static. You couldn't let men just go to the toilet in their trenches because they would be surrounded by human filth and disease would be absolutely rife. So very quickly they learned to dig little saps, little trenches off the main trench, perhaps to connect up a shell hole, put a pole across that shell hole, and soldiers would use the toilet there, and it would be in an open cesspit, basically. But then that would create its own problems, because although the soldiers had gone to the toilet, the human waste would create huge clouds of flies hanging over it, and they would disperse when soldiers walked into that latrine, that then would draw the attention of the enemy, and shell fire and mortar fire would come over. And I think, as we've said before on this podcast, there were men killed going to the toilet. So more sophisticated latrines were eventually developed. But one thing that they did not have was toilet paper. It just was not possible to do that in positions like this. It would have probably been considered a waste of resources. And the veteran that you heard talking about his experiences at Gallipoli, I've read this as well. I interviewed men who served at Gallipoli. They had exactly the same problem. They were eating food covered in flies, often ate the flies too, which had been feasting on dead bodies in no man's land. So disease there spread very, very quickly indeed. And they were in a terrible situation with dysentery at Gallipoli, where, without making it really unpleasant to listen to, exactly the kind of thing that you described, where soldiers were having to use their hands to then wipe on their trousers, that was happening all the time to some of these men. It was just an awful, awful situation that many soldiers were in there. And to a lesser extent, that kind of thing happened on the Western Front, although once the war became static and supplies kept moving forward and the diet of the British soldier was kind of controlled by the army to make sure he got enough calories and certain types of food, one of the things they would try and do through this diet is try and ensure that soldiers' stools were hard and not soft, because that would make it a lot easier for them to go to the toilet. And one veteran I interviewed joked that they needed a machete to carve off what came out of their backside, basically, again, without getting too unpleasant. But this is the reality of going to the toilet in a trench system in those early years on the Western Front. Now, while there was no toilet paper issued, that doesn't mean that soldiers didn't take paper in there with them to try and have some degree of normality by going to the loo. And they would use just about everything that they could get their hands on. Newspapers were sent out on a regular basis to men on the front line, and I can remember in my grandmother's outside toilet in the East End of London when I was a kid in the 70s, squares of cut-up newspaper being pinned to the inside of the privy as an emergency issue if the main toilet paper ran out. And these men probably had some kind of similar experience in their civilian life, so weren't really averse to using newspaper as toilet paper when they were in the trenches. So that was a potential source. And as the war went on, trench newspapers were printed behind the lines and distributed to the men in the forward zone, the Wipers Times being one of the most famous. And again, being made out of paper, they'd be read, they'd be laughed at, and they'd be laughed over, and then they would be used for another purpose. But there was one provision of paper that came regularly to soldiers that was used as improvised toilet paper, and that was letters from home. You'd be sent a letter all the time. You'd get lots of them in the post from your mother, your father, your sisters, your brothers, all kinds of family members. And while you treasure these things, in an emergency when you needed to go to the toilet and all you had were some letters from home, believe me, you would use them. And I know that soldiers did exactly that. And it's quite unusual, in fact, to find soldiers' letters that were sent to them. There's lots of collection of letters that are from the soldiers back to their folks at home, but the letters that were sent to them don't survive as much because they were used as toilet paper. So while you might have received a lovely letter from your mum and be pleased about that and read it many times over, when push came to shove, often quite literally, then you might employ that letter for this different purpose. And it's quite a grim subject, this. It's not to be laughed at, really, because this, again, is the reality of this. And you imagine on other fronts, we've already discussed Gallipoli and the problems there, but Salonika, Mesopotamia, Palestine, all of those theatres of war with differing weather, differing conditions, problem with disease, fighting in the desert of Iraq in Mesopotamia, or the deserts of Egypt and Gaza in Palestine in the First World War, then dysentery in those theatres of operations were not uncommon. Salonika with mosquitoes, sickness and dysentery was not uncommon there either. And that would lead to a often very uncomfortable life for soldiers on the front line who were not cosseted in any kind of way with even the basic provision of very, very basic toilet paper when they were having to use latrines under these kind of conditions, not just on the Western Front, but all of these theatres of operation. So it's part of the reality of a soldier's life on a battlefield like this, part of that grim and dark element, really, of the First World War. So thanks for that question, Benjo. Thanks for all the questions this week. Hopefully, once again, the questions and more importantly the answers have been of interest. You can send your questions and keep them coming in via the usual methods of email and the Discord server and a few others besides. And we'll be back again soon for some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.